Ella Stanley had never considered herself someone who craved conflict, but she had always been someone who recognized the value of self-reliance. That's why, when the opportunity arose to rent a modest acreage just beyond the edge of suburban sprawl, tucked behind the final ring of postmodern rooftops and decorative mailbox clusters, she didn't hesitate. The land wasn't glamorous, it was dry in patches and swampy in others, but it was functional. It came with a barn, a serviceable perimeter fence, and just enough distance from the main road to make the world feel manageable. For Ella, who had spent most of her professional life in agricultural support programs and local outreach farming initiatives, it was a second chance to put her skills to use. This time, not for bureaucrats or spreadsheets, but for something tangible and alive. She leased the property with a clear plan in mind. She would raise goats, but not as some aesthetic rural fantasy. These were specialty breeds, docile, well-behaved animals used in therapeutic sessions with children on the autism spectrum. Ella wasn't just keeping livestock for profit. She had signed a grant-backed agreement with a small liberal arts college to serve as a satellite site for their animal-assisted therapy curriculum. Twice a month, students would come down to observe, take notes, and participate in routines designed to calm both animal and human. It was quiet work, repetitive in the best ways, and it gave Ella a sense of direction that the previous years, which had been saturated with administrative nonsense and organizational fatigue, had robbed from her. The property was not part of the neighboring community's civic circle, the self-proclaimed residential committee, but it was close enough to brush elbows. Her land shared a fence line with a row of luxury homes marketed to environmentally conscious retirees and upwardly mobile remote workers. Most of them kept to themselves, their homes shielded behind ornamental pines and zen gardens with motion-detecting sprinklers. But one house stood out from the rest, not because of its architecture or decor, but because of the woman who lived there. Karen Albright was something of a known quantity in the area. She had written several picture books for children about harmony with nature, and considered herself both a steward of the land and an educator at large. Her property, a meticulously curated homage to old-world botanical philosophies, was full of reclaimed stone paths, hand-painted signs about bees and birds, and a miniature koi pond she referred to as her wild soul mirror. Karen's online presence was far larger than one might expect for a woman who lived on the edge of town. Her YouTube channel, Living Naturally with Karen, had amassed tens of thousands of followers, mostly suburban women looking for organic recipes, garden hacks, and platitudes about spiritual connectedness with plant life. She recorded videos nearly every day, wandering barefoot across her lawn, sipping from a mason jar of infused rainwater, talking about energy flow and natural intelligence. It didn't take long before Karen noticed Ella. More specifically, it didn't take long for Karen to notice the goats. The first interaction had been oddly performative. Karen had arrived at Ella's gate with a lemon basil sprig and a smile so tightly wound it practically buzzed. She introduced herself with a monologue that felt rehearsed, a string of affirmations about community, wellness, and the vibrational frequency of living things. Ella, polite but unimpressed, thanked her for the herbs and excused herself. There were hooves to trim and feed buckets to fill. Karen left with an expression that seemed equal parts offense and fascination. From that day on, Ella became the subject of Karen's quiet disapproval, the kind delivered not through direct confrontation, but through passive observation and exaggerated online storytelling. Karen would record long, unbroken shots of the shared fence line in her videos, lamenting the spiritually stifling enclosures that some people choose to imprison their animals behind. She would speak about how modern society had commodified the sentient experience of herbivorous mammals, without ever saying Ella's name. But the implication was clear. It didn't help that Ella's barn was visible from Karen's upper patio, a detail Karen never failed to mention as a disruption to her morning meditations. Ella did her best to ignore it. She had no interest in a petty turf war with a woman who staged her compost piles for Instagram. As long as Karen stayed on her side of the property line and kept her drone camera out of Ella's fields, they could live in a state of mutual, if tense, invisibility. That balance held for a few months. The goats settled into their grazing routine, the therapy sessions with students began, and Ella found herself slowly rebuilding a rhythm she hadn't realized she'd missed. Then came the letter. Folded without an envelope and shoved under the latch on her main gate, it was printed in a pseudo-calligraphic font that reeked of over-designed word templates. On behalf of the surrounding residents, it read, "We would like to formally express concern about the visible suffering and unnatural restraint placed upon the animal companions in your care." There was no signature, but the type of stationery, ATE, handmade recycled blend with pressed lavender, and the overuse of the phrase energetic dissonance left no room for doubt as to who had penned it. Ella didn't respond. Instead, she filed the letter, took photos of the handwriting, and informed the property owner of the growing tensions, just in case things escalated. Her landlord, a woman in her 60s named Marion who lived 2 towns over, replied with a brief, supportive text. "Ignore the spiritual gardeners. Fence is yours. Animals are insured. Keep me posted if it gets weird." Weird came a few days later. Ella returned from a supply run to find her side gate unlatched and 3 of the goats trotting freely along the outer path near the edge of the property. One was limping slightly, her right hoof scuffed and bleeding from contact with a broken piece of fence wire. The rest were skittish, as if something, or someone, had herded them out rather than them wandering by accident. The gate's lock had been clipped clean, not forced or rusted through, but cut, deliberately. Nearby, a small hand-painted sign leaned against the fence. "Let them return to the wild within. They don't belong behind bars." That night, Ella walked the perimeter 3 times, flashlight in hand, checking every post, every rail, every weak spot. She made temporary repairs and kept the goats in the barn overnight. But sleep didn't come easy. She wasn't scared exactly. She was angry. Her anger wasn't a reaction to the damage. It was a reaction to the arrogance. Whoever did this had made a decision for her, had acted not out of concern for the animals, but from a place of self-righteous entitlement. And the worst part? She knew exactly who it was. Not in a way that could hold up in court. Not in a way that could be recorded or traced. But in the way a farmer knows her soil, or a mother knows the difference between silence and peace. Karen. Ella didn't storm over to confront her. She didn't shout across the fence line or leave angry notes in retaliation. What she did was far more methodical. She opened a claim with her insurance company for animal endangerment and property tampering. She called the landlord and had a professional inspection scheduled. And then, in a decision that would turn out to be more consequential than she realized, she filed a request with the Regional Agricultural Board for formal recognition of her livestock operation as a protected educational site, an official designation that would add legal teeth to any future incidents. She wasn't just going to protect her goats. She was going to make it so that the next time someone tried to set them free, they'd have to answer not just to her, but to the law. And that, she thought grimly, was the real meaning of freedom. The damage didn't stop with a cut fence and a few scattered goats. What had happened was not a one-time act of self-expression. It was the opening move in a strategy that Ella hadn't seen coming, but one she recognized now for what it was. A campaign. Subtle at first, wrapped in the language of benevolence and nature-loving, but nonetheless pointed, deliberate, and escalating. Within days of the first incident, Karen's online presence shifted in tone. She began making thinly veiled references to neglectful animal keepers in her videos, claiming she had witnessed acts of confinement that disturbed her, and encouraging her viewers to speak up for the voiceless. She didn't mention Ella by name. Of course, that would be too obvious, too actionable, but the context was unmistakable to anyone living within 10 miles of that fence. Then came the community bulletin board posts. The local feed, which usually hosted announcements for garage sales and piano lessons, suddenly featured a series of wellness-themed essays authored by concerned gardeners, warning of the psychic harm caused by industrial animal enclosures and promoting a new local initiative called Freedom to Graze. The initiative, allegedly grassroots, advocated for the loosening of aggressive property boundaries to allow for what it described as natural migration of herbivorous species. The accompanying images were professional, the rhetoric polished, and the hashtag suspiciously aligned with Karen's public branding. Ella would have dismissed it all as harmless noise if not for what happened next. One morning, after checking the perimeter and finding everything intact, she went into town for supplies. It was a short trip, just 40 minutes total, but when she returned, something felt off. The air was quiet, too quiet, and the goats, usually vocal in their anticipation of her return, were nowhere in sight. She moved quickly across the field and found the barn doors unlatched, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, hay was scattered, feed bins tipped over, and the animals gone. Every single one of them. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she ran the length of the property, calling out names, whistling, scanning the tree line for any movement. Tracks in the dirt showed hoof prints moving westward, toward the adjoining lots, toward Karen. Ella didn't hesitate. She climbed into her truck and took the long route around, following the access road that led to the formal entrance of the neighboring residential zone. She drove slowly, scanning yards and hedges, and just as she reached Karen's property line, she saw them, her goats, milling nervously among ornamental shrubs and stepping carefully across carefully raked gravel. Some were chewing on low-hanging flower baskets. One had climbed onto a decorative bench, and there, standing barefoot in her open garden gate, was Karen, holding what appeared to be a shallow bowl of oats. Karen didn't flinch when she saw Ella. She smiled, wide, deliberate, vaguely triumphant, and tilted her head as if to say, "Well, look what happened." Ella got out of the truck, calm but firm, and called to the goats. Most of them came immediately, clearly disoriented but not injured. As she led them back toward the road, Karen spoke. Not loud, not accusatory, but with the smooth edge of practiced public performance. "They came here on their own," she said, voice lilting with that faux wisdom tone so often used by people who mistake passive aggression for spiritual depth. "It's amazing what they'll do when they're not afraid." Ella turned, squinting against the sun. "Did you open my gate?" she asked, not because she expected an honest answer, but because it needed to be said. Karen pressed a hand to her chest. "I would never trespass. But gates, Ella, they're a construct. Boundaries are illusions. You know that, don't you?" Ella stared at her for a long, quiet moment, then looked back at the still open barn door and the line of hoof prints that had clearly come from inside, not outside. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Truth had already left its trail in the dirt. That evening, she filed a police report, not because she thought it would lead to an arrest or even a warning, but to establish a timeline. She submitted photos, listed the prior incidents, provided the insurance claims, the signed educational agreement, and every documented conversation with the landlord. The officer was polite, professional, and ultimately non-committal. There was no footage, no eyewitness beyond herself, and the goats hadn't been abused, only relocated. He promised to include the information in the log and encouraged her to reinforce her locks and consider security measures. The next morning, Karen uploaded a video titled, "Trust the Wild When They Choose Freedom." In it, she sat cross-legged on a meditation mat, the bleating of goats audible in the background, and spoke at length about surrendering control. "Sometimes," she said, looking directly into the camera, "we're just vessels for liberation. We don't have to own everything. We don't have to manage everything. We just have to witness." The video received thousands of views. The comments were full of platitudes and prayer hands emojis. Ella didn't watch the rest. Instead, she spent the next 3 days making preparations. Not just repairing the barn and adding steel brackets to the gates, but contacting the college, her insurer, and a livestock law consultant she found through the regional co-op network. She explained the situation in detail, provided documentation, and requested legal clarification on what constituted interference with educational livestock. The answer was both promising and frustrating. While animals used for educational purposes carried certain protections, enforcement relied heavily on demonstrable damages or threats. Karen's interference, however morally repugnant, still danced frustratingly close to the line of legality. But then came the detail that shifted everything. During a conversation with the consultant, Ella learned about a classification code for agricultural operations that could offer her new leverage, Category E7, under the Regional Ag Board, which recognized small educational farms as semi-public livestock initiatives. The designation didn't just offer tax benefits, it granted additional legal safeguards in cases of unauthorized removal or obstruction. To qualify, however, Ella needed not just paperwork but community verification. She needed signatures from neighboring landowners, including proof that her animals were not a nuisance and that the farm maintained proper ethical standards. Ella didn't hesitate. She went door to door, not to Karen, of course, but to the other homes on the outer loop, the ones who had never commented or interfered. Most had barely noticed her operation. A few were curious, asking thoughtful questions. All of them signed, except one. 2 houses down from Karen's, a man named Lucas Beale hesitated when she knocked. He was a middle-aged software contractor who had moved in recently and maintained a pristine yard with solar-powered lighting and artificial turf. He looked tired, overworked, disinterested, but after Ella explained the situation, he surprised her by inviting her in for a moment. Over coffee, he admitted something that caught her off guard. Karen had visited him the week before with a basket of sage and an informal petition she claimed would help protect local gardens from cross-contamination by invasive animal waste. She had implied that Ella's goats were carriers of disease, that they could upset the microbial balance of the soil, and had even mentioned contacting the zoning board. Lucas hadn't signed anything, but he had listened. And now, hearing the other side, he realized how one-sided the presentation had been. He signed her document without hesitation. Ella left with his signature and a silent confirmation that what she was facing wasn't eccentricity. It was manipulation, carefully dressed up as community concern, backed by a digital soapbox and steeped in language just vague enough to dodge consequences. She returned home and submitted the application for the E7 designation. The wheels would take time to turn. There would be inspections, perhaps even pushback. But now the record was official. There was a line, and it had been drawn in ink. Karen had wanted to let the goats be free. That part Ella could work with, because if freedom was what Karen respected, then maybe it was time to give her a taste of it, on her own lawn, with documentation, with witnesses, and with a little help from some well-fed goats wearing custom-made tags that said exactly what they were, roaming representatives of one woman's refusal to be dictated to by nonsense disguised as nature. Ella didn't act out of impulse. She never had. That was part of what irritated people like Karen so deeply. Ella's refusal to take the bait, her maddening calm, the way she met every escalation not with outrage or melodrama but with process, with policy, with slow, deliberate steps that were much harder to argue against than shouting. That kind of discipline wasn't theatrical, but it was effective. And now, with her designation application pending, her legal file thickening, and her animals safely back in their reinforced pens, she turned her attention toward preemptive defense. She knew Karen wasn't done. The goats had been a theatrical piece, something to stir sympathy among Karen's followers and create that illusion of gentle rebellion against imagined cruelty. But now that Ella had turned the incident into something documented, with administrative weight behind it, Karen would pivot. She would not lash out. She would evolve her approach, dressing her sabotage in the trappings of righteousness, turning what she framed as animal advocacy into an attack on Ella's legitimacy as a caretaker, as a professional, and as a neighbor. The first sign came in the form of a flyer, tucked under the windshield wiper of Ella's truck while it was parked outside the feed store. The paper was pastel green, adorned with watercolor leaves and a smiling goat drawn in cartoon style. Across the top, "Let them roam." Below that, a list of reasons to oppose unnecessary animal imprisonment in our community, citing everything from psychological distress in livestock to residue runoff from hooved mammals that may threaten wildflower diversity. There was no author listed, but the email at the bottom, naturesoulpathigmail.com, was one Ella recognized from a prior dispute in a local garden forum. Karen naturally denied authorship when someone brought it up online. "I can't speak for those who feel called to take action," she wrote in a carefully worded comment, "but I support their heart-centered intention." It would have been laughable if it weren't so calculated. The next week, during a scheduled visit from the agriculture inspector tied to her E7 designation, Ella noticed something strange. One of the goats, Lila, a young doe who was usually the most docile of the group, refused to eat her grain. Her movements were sluggish, her breathing shallow. Ella called the vet, who arrived within an hour, took samples, and ran tests. The diagnosis: mild toxicity. Not lethal, but concerning. Something had been introduced into her diet that wasn't part of her normal routine. Ella reviewed her feed storage and double-checked all the containers. Everything was sealed. The water tanks were clean. But then she remembered the loose straw scattered near the rear fence line, a corner where Karen's overgrown pollinator zone pressed up against Ella's side of the property. The vet collected samples from the area, and the following afternoon confirmed the presence of oleander, an ornamental plant often used in meditative gardens for its vibrant color and mild hallucinogenic properties, but one that was highly toxic to goats. Ella didn't confront Karen. She submitted a second report to the inspector, who now had cause to flag the neighboring property as a potential hazard under E7 provisions. Karen, perhaps realizing what was coming, spent the next 2 days aggressively trimming back her pollinator bushes and posting videos about overregulation as a threat to natural symbiosis. The pressure, however, didn't ease. 2 days later, Ella found her mailbox stuffed with printed pages, copies of supposed research articles warning about zoonotic transfer from goats to humans, complete with highlighted sections about bacteria risks and contamination zones. None of the articles were from reputable journals, and most linked back to obscure naturopathy blogs. But she recognized the tactic. Fear by footnote, a campaign meant not to convince, but to flood the space with doubt. Meanwhile, Karen ramped up her online activity. In a video titled, "The Grass is Greener When They're Gone," she walked along her fence line, speaking in hushed tones about invasive species, the burden of unnatural domestication, and the silent trauma echoing from barns. Behind her, she had installed small wooden signs with poetic phrases. "Freedom begins at the gate. No hooves on my herbs. Life is not a leash." Her audience, ever supportive, flooded the comments with affirmations and soft outrage. Some even offered to rescue the goats if Ella would let them go. It was absurd, yes, but absurdity has power when it is wrapped in aesthetics and emotion. Ella couldn't afford to roll her eyes and move on. She had students arriving in 10 days for their semester practicum. Any more disruptions could jeopardize the program, the funding, the fragile ecosystem of trust she'd worked so carefully to maintain with the college board. So she responded, not publicly, not online, but strategically. She contacted the local zoning office and requested an audit of the shared fence line, citing suspected illegal planting near the boundary and environmental hazards affecting livestock. She followed that with a consultation from a private soil expert, paid for out of pocket, who confirmed trace contamination likely originating from the runoff near Karen's water mirror, her decorative koi pond, which had apparently been dosed with non-approved organic growth agents. Ella didn't publish the findings. She didn't send threats. She quietly included them in her application file and submitted copies to the Agriculture Board liaison. The more she documented, the more Karen escalated in her own direction. The week before the students were scheduled to arrive, Ella found a new structure on Karen's property, a raised platform built just above fence height, styled as an observation deck. From it, one could look directly into Ella's pastures. Karen claimed it was for bird watching. In reality, she spent most afternoons perched atop it, sipping from her mason jar, narrating live videos about coerced animal behavior and the aesthetics of confinement. She made a show of calling out to the goats by name, offering dried fruit, through the slats in the fence and repeating the phrase, "Come home to the earth." Ella had installed motion cameras the previous month, standard security protocol, but even with footage, enforcement remained limited. The fence line, though legally hers, was not immune to visual surveillance, and yet the absurdity of the deck became a flashpoint. Local gossip picked it up. Other residents began to murmur about the weird tower thing Karen built, and at least one neighbor filed a quiet complaint to the district planning office about unsanctioned structures exceeding privacy height limitations. Still, Ella wasn't taking chances. She called a meeting with her attorney, the college liaison, and the agriculture consultant. They reviewed her documentation, updated the timeline of events, and made a decision. It was time to stop playing reactive defense. With full backing from her support team, Ella submitted an injunction request citing continuous interference, environmental risk, and harassment under the guise of ecological activism. The filing didn't target Karen by name. It didn't have to. The language pointed unmistakably to her property, her behavior, her symbolic vandalism disguised as philosophy. 2 days later, Ella received an envelope delivered by courier. Inside was a letter, hand-signed by Karen, written in florid prose and riddled with metaphors. It did not apologize. It did not admit wrongdoing. It stated, in essence, that Karen believed she was spiritually obligated to intervene where suffering persisted, and that she would continue to act in accordance with the will of the ecosystem. The last line read, "You cannot own what belongs to the wild." Ella set the letter aside, opened her laptop, and began drafting the tags. Each goat would wear one, attached gently but firmly to their collars, bright, laminated, and visible from any camera or deck. They would read, "Certified Non-Nuisance Livestock, E7 Compliant, Section 42, free to roam where permitted." They weren't just for show. They were official. Karen had framed this battle in terms of liberation. Ella was happy to play along, because liberation, when properly documented, was an excellent legal defense, and soon it would also become her next move. The night before Ella's response, she didn't sleep, not because of fear, but because her mind wouldn't stop assembling the pieces. Each incident, each note, each smirk that passed between the slats in the fence like smoke. Karen had built her campaign like a slow-burning incense trail, coiling with false grace until the fumes filled every room Ella walked into. But Ella had never been passive. She wasn't someone who mistook silence for surrender. So, when the morning sun broke across the dry crest of the pasture, Ella had already completed the work. 12 goats, freshly brushed and tagged, stood in a calm line behind the east gate. Their collars were clean leather, fitted with the laminated tags she had made by hand. The lettering was clear, sharp, and bureaucratically worded. Not whimsical, not aggressive, but official. Certified Non-Nuisance Livestock, Section E7A Compliance. Property transfer observed. No emotion, no satire, just legality, dressed in plastic and quietly lethal. She opened the gate. It was not trespassing. The adjoining strip of land between the properties had been the subject of an unresolved survey dispute from years ago, an ambiguous easement zone that neither Karen nor the prior landowners had definitively claimed, though Karen had treated it like her private buffer garden. Ella, through research, had identified a clause. As long as the zone was unfenced and within shared rural boundaries, registered livestock under E7 classification had right of passage for grazing if supervised and not constituting threat, nuisance, or contamination. Ella wasn't walking the goats through Karen's vegetable beds or ornamental grass displays. She was letting them drift, quietly, peaceably, munching at overgrowth and pruning the thornier bushes Karen had so carefully cultivated as a natural barrier. Karen came outside an hour later, robe flapping in the breeze, mouth partially open as if the words had left without. Her. She stopped at the edge of her property, arms crossed tightly, watching the goats nibble their way through a line of drought-resistant perennials. Her eyes bounced between the goats and the laminated tags, visibly scanning the wording, brow furrowing in slow disbelief. Ella stood near the fence with her clipboard and radio. "Are you serious?" Karen finally called out, her voice stripped of its silk. "What exactly is this? What are you doing?" Ella looked up slowly. "They're grazing," she said flatly. "Rotational exposure. Within the zone. It's authorized." She didn't add anything else. She didn't have to. The goats, wearing documentation like armor, were doing the talking. Karen took a cautious step forward, avoiding one of her own pathstones. "You can't let them destroy everything. This is malicious. This is personal." "No," Ella said, now looking her in the eye. "It's policy." Karen tried to film. Of course she did, but even her footage worked against her, because what she captured wasn't chaos, wasn't violence. It was measured, quiet activity. Goats doing what goats do, eating, moving, wearing tags that quoted municipal codes and board-issued compliance numbers. Her followers online were confused. Some applauded her for bringing them to safety. Others questioned why she hadn't stopped them. And many simply asked, "Are you sure this was a good idea?" By the end of the second day, Karen had taken her garden live streams offline. But Ella knew better than to believe it was over. Karen would pivot again. The next move came in the form of a formal complaint. Not against Ella directly, but to the college whose students were enrolled in her therapeutic livestock project. An anonymous letter accused Ella of permitting animals to roam unsupervised, creating emotional distress for neighboring residents and fostering an uncontrolled agricultural environment. The letter was 3 pages long, laced with academic-sounding language and vague references to industry standards of livestock management. The college liaison forwarded it to Ella with a short note. "Looks like someone's getting creative. I'll respond formally." Ella read the letter twice, calm but methodical, and added it to the growing file. But she also recognized the strategy. Discredit the mission. Undermine her through the institution, not through the land. If Karen couldn't win with fences, she'd aim for the foundation. So Ella responded the way she always did, through structure. She invited the liaison for an unscheduled visit. Not a meeting, not a call, but a walkthrough. Let them see the site, the state of the animals, the grazing system, the documentation board she had posted outside the barn with every current compliance number updated in bold print. The liaison arrived the following Tuesday. They stayed for 3 hours, took notes, interviewed Ella, reviewed the student access plan, the animal logs, the daily health checks recorded with timestamps and initials. They left with a thank you and a quiet shake of the head that said, "We know what this is." The next morning, Ella found her garbage bins knocked over. The night after that, someone left a stack of "Let Them Be Free" stickers pasted across her mailbox. A drone buzzed low over her pasture one afternoon and then vanished behind Karen's trees. The harassment was small, cheap, and cowardly. But it didn't stop. Still, Ella remained steady. Each incident went into the log. The goats grazed, rested, wore their tags. The students arrived. They came with notebooks and nervous energy and stood in gentle rows beside the fencing, their questions hesitant but eager. Ella taught. She explained. She let them lead feed cycles and monitor health markers and walk the goats gently between shaded stations. One of the students, a first year with a quiet voice and shaky hands, stood for almost 20 minutes beside the oldest goat, stroking her flank, saying nothing. When Ella looked over, he was crying. None of it was performative. None of it was dramatic. It was all real, which made it, in its own way, indestructible. That night, Ella sat on the edge of her porch with a cup of cold coffee, watching the barn lights hum gently across the grass. She knew the air before the storm. She knew that Karen wasn't through. The next step would come soon, larger, louder, and more desperate. People like Karen didn't lose quietly. They didn't bow out. They doubled down. But Ella wasn't afraid of escalation. She was prepared for it. Because she hadn't built a farm. She'd built a case. The storm didn't come as wind or rain, though Ella would have preferred that. No, the next wave of escalation came cloaked in bureaucracy. Real papers, notarized pages, and a courier in a neatly pressed shirt who arrived at her gate at 7:30 in the morning with a padded envelope and a signature request. The return address listed no name, only a legal firm from 2 counties over that Ella didn't recognize. Inside, stacked in precise order, were copies of a formal grievance submitted to the Regional Zoning Commission, a demand for investigation from a local civic concern collective, and a preliminary notice from the county office indicating a review had been scheduled for the following week to assess permitting discrepancies in her operation. Attached was a photocopy of her land layout, marked in red pen, circles drawn around the barn, the gate, and what Karen had always referred to as the native wild corridor, though Ella had never seen anything in that patch of brush but rabbits and thistles. Karen had escalated to the real game now, weaponizing the system. She hadn't tried to destroy Ella's property directly, at least not this time. She had done something smarter, more dangerous. She had asked the system to look closer, not to punish, not to accuse, but to doubt, to inspect, to pause. Because in bureaucratic machinery, a pause could mean everything. A frozen designation, a delayed permit, a revoked grant. And all it took was a whisper of uncertainty dressed in official formatting to trigger it. Ella spent the next few hours on the phone. Her zoning consultant, the agriculture board liaison, her landlord, the college's program director, each call calm, methodical, precise. She didn't plead, she presented. They agreed to help, offered statements, sent copies of previously approved diagrams, inspection logs, and photographs from the most recent walkthrough. But they also warned her. Once a complaint triggers the Regional Zoning Review Board, it doesn't stop until it completes its cycle. Even if baseless, even if anonymous, the process runs its course. The following day, a man in an orange safety vest parked near the edge of Ella's property and spent 3 hours pacing the perimeter, taking measurements with a laser rangefinder and snapping photos. He didn't introduce himself. Ella didn't interrupt him. She just logged the time, the direction of his photos, and noted when he paused longest, by the new gate and near the shared fence line where Karen's pollinator zone still crowded the edge like a decorative insult. That evening, Karen uploaded another video, this one more somber, carefully framed. She wore white linen and stood beside a table with a single lit candle framed by soft music and drifting incense. "There are moments," she said, voice breathy, "when we must protect the spaces we've nurtured. Spaces of peace, spaces of healing. And sometimes that means standing against the mechanical systems that seek to industrialize the sacred. I've taken action, not out of malice, but to give voice to what cannot be spoken." The comments flooded in, full of sympathy and platitudes and virtual hugs. Karen's audience didn't ask for facts. They never did. They asked for feelings. And she gave them plenty. But the legal machinery wasn't sentimental. It moved on wheels of documentation, precedent, and recorded procedure. And Ella had those in spades. 3 days before the scheduled zoning inspection, Ella discovered her outer lockbox where she stored backup tools had been opened. Nothing was missing, nothing obviously moved, but the lock had been snapped clean, replaced with a fake identical copy that gave way at the slightest turn. Someone wanted access. Someone wanted to make it look untouched. She installed another motion sensor camera facing that direction, this one more discreet than the others, and moved the box indoors. That same night she noticed shadows along the rear property line. Too slow for animals, too straight for wildlife. The footage the next morning confirmed it. 2 figures wearing hooded jackets, walking the fence line with handheld lights and pausing every few yards to lean close to the slats. No faces, no vehicle, no trespass, technically. But presence. Measured, careful presence. A test of nerves. A show of reach. Ella didn't react publicly. She submitted the footage through the proper channel, forwarded a copy to her legal rep, and added the timestamp to her case log. If the review board tried to question the stability or safety of her property, she would be ready. And if they asked why someone might want to delay her designation, she would have answers, evidence, and a paper trail that stretched back to the first clipped gate. The day of the inspection arrived under low clouds and stiff winds. A county vehicle pulled into the gravel drive, followed by a second with the logo of the zoning board etched faintly on its side. 2 men and 1 woman stepped out, all in dark jackets, clipboards in hand, expressions neutral but alert. Ella greeted them with printed packets, maps, design plans, the E7 paperwork with every update, a log of all visitor entries, the vet reports, and her soil compliance forms. She didn't smile, but she didn't waver. She walked them through each sector of the property, answered their questions plainly, cited regulations when necessary, and paused only once, by the shared fence line, where a new laminated sign had appeared on Karen's side overnight. Community, sanctuary, disturb with intention only. One of the inspectors raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. By the end of the visit, no conclusions were drawn. They never are. They thanked her for her time, said a report would be filed, and disappeared back into their vehicles like bureaucratic ghosts. That evening, Ella took a walk down the long side of her property, not to check the fence, not to look for damage, but to breathe. Her body ached from the restraint of the day, from keeping her tone even, her answers sharp, her expressions measured. This wasn't a war of violence. It was a war of endurance. Halfway down the line, she noticed the scent first. Something acrid, earthy, wrong. She rounded the far tree and found the remnants of a burned pile. Small, contained, but deliberately lit just past the edge of her field. At the center, blackened scraps of laminated plastic, the edge of a collar tag, melted into the dirt. Someone had taken one of the goat's tags, how they got it, she couldn't be sure, and destroyed it where it could be found. A message. She didn't panic. She didn't even flinch. She stood there, breathing slowly, and then pulled out her phone, took photos, bagged the debris, and walked it back up to the house. Then she opened her laptop and filled out an incident report with the agricultural board. No speculation, no accusations. Just time, date, description, and attachments. Then she submitted it and went to the barn to check the goats. All present, all safe, all unaware that they had just become symbols in a war they didn't understand. That night, Karen posted nothing. Her channel went quiet. Her garden lights didn't flicker. Her incense didn't curl above the deck. But Ella knew. The silence wasn't surrender. It was planning. And so she planned, too. She updated every permit, prepared every file, created hard backups of all documentation. She installed a backup battery on her fence sensors and contacted a second legal firm to review her contract with the college. She wasn't just defending a pasture anymore. She was defending precedent. Because if Karen succeeded in turning feelings into authority, in converting aesthetic into legal weaponry, then Ella would be the first of many to fall. And that she could not allow. It happened finally, not with a confrontation or explosion, but with a single anonymous call to animal control. That's how these things usually begin, impersonally, without a voice to confront or a face to hold accountable. The officer arrived early, clipboard in hand, expression bland with protocol. He told Ella, in the same tone one might use to inform someone their tire was flat, that a complaint had been filed. Accusations of neglect, unsanitary conditions, visible animal stress, and suspected unlawful medication use on livestock. He clarified that the complaint didn't come with evidence, but since it was filed within a registered agricultural area and given the recent zoning activity, they were obligated to follow up. Ella said nothing for a moment, letting the words hang in the air like smoke from a fire no one had admitted to lighting. Then she gestured toward the barn. He followed her through every part of the property. The feed logs, the vet's signed certifications, the health records, even the cleaning schedules. Ella had it all. Neatly printed, laminated, dated, verified. He checked water levels, feed stations, shelter conditions, fencing, and hoof health. He asked questions with the steady rhythm of a man doing a job he wasn't particularly passionate about but was determined to complete. And when he left, 2 hours later, he gave her a brief nod and said, "I don't see any issues here. Report will reflect that. No apology, just procedure. But the real damage was already done. Not to Ella's animals or her paperwork, but to the rhythm of the place, to the quiet. The goats were anxious. The students, who had witnessed the visit from a distance, whispered among themselves in nervous half-thoughts. The liaison had to reassure them that it was routine, that inspections were normal in agricultural work, but even he looked unsettled. No one said it, but everyone knew. This wasn't organic. This was sabotage in procedural form. The goats may have grazed as usual that afternoon, but Ella could feel the edge sharpen against her skin. Something was building. That evening, long after the students had left, Ella heard it. An engine rumbling, not down the main drive, but along the unmarked utility trail that curved along the rear boundary of her land. She stepped out onto the porch with her flashlight sweeping at once across the pasture. Nothing. Then again, slower. At the far edge of the property, near the easement line that had sparked months of silent war, a figure moved, too fast to identify, too deliberate to be accident. The flashlight beam caught the gleam of a reflective vest. Then nothing. She didn't chase. She went inside, pulled up her remote camera system, and watched. In grainy black and white, the figure knelt by the fence line. They didn't damage it this time. They buried something, a small black bundle tucked at the base of one of the corner posts. Ella marked the time, noted the camera angle, and called the sheriff's department. She reported suspicious behavior on private agricultural land, possibly connected to prior targeted incidents. When the officer arrived an hour later, Ella led him to the spot. The bundle contained food, pellets, oats, and crushed supplements. At first glance, nothing unusual, but the sheriff noted it anyway, bagged it, and submitted it to the lab for testing. Ella didn't need results. She already knew. Someone had tried to introduce a health variable, something that couldn't be traced to a person, only to a condition. Poison? Maybe. A substance that would trigger a digestive reaction in goats. More likely, something temporary, just enough to trigger another anonymous inspection and finally derail her designation. Except it hadn't worked, and now it was in police custody. The shift happened quietly. Karen, who had remained silent online for several days, returned with a different tone. Her next video, posted 3 days after the food incident, was not filmed in her garden. She sat indoors, her face partially shadowed, and spoke in vague terms about being misunderstood, about the cost of standing up for the voiceless, and how systems always fight back harder when their foundations are threatened. Her tone was mournful, even fragile. She said she was stepping back for the time being to focus on internal alignment. Her audience responded with concern, devotion, and sympathy. Comments poured in, but offline things were moving. Ella's report had triggered more than just a lab test. The Agriculture Board, already tired of the procedural interference, escalated the matter. The Regional Enforcement Division filed a request for a temporary no-contact buffer between Karen's property and Ella's. They cited multiple confirmed incidents of interference, potential contamination, and visual harassment. The zoning office, finally spurred into formality, began reviewing Karen's own land use claims, discovering irregularities in how she had expanded her so-called sanctuary space into undeclared public utility right-of-way. A week later, a citation was posted on Karen's front gate, sealed in plastic and nailed to the wooden arch she had once decorated with wildflowers. The document was clear: a cease and desist notice regarding unauthorized structures, improper waste filtration near a protected boundary, and failure to register fertilizer use beyond permitted limits. She could appeal, of course, but the review process had been initiated, and the language was not forgiving. Ella didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She didn't post anything online. She showed up to the pasture, fed the goats, checked their hooves, brushed their coats, and marked the daily logs. Her attorney called that afternoon to inform her that, thanks to the cumulative evidence and pending enforcement action against Karen, her E7 designation had been accelerated. Approved, locked, certified, effective immediately. The goats now belonged to a legally protected program. Her fence now marked the boundary of a state-recognized educational facility, and Karen, who had once tried to tear it all down in the name of natural harmony, now stood on the other side of a red-taped property line, legally prohibited from stepping within 10 feet of Ella's livestock or interfering in any documented way. That night, Ella took one last walk along the pasture fence. The stars above were clear, the wind cold and clean. The goats, asleep in the barn, breathed quietly beneath the soft, red glow of the night lamp. In her hand, she held one of the laminated tags she'd made weeks before. Cracked now, the corners bent. She didn't hang it. She laid it on the post nearest to Karen's property and walked away. There was no final word. No dramatic confrontation. Just a silence restored, and a boundary that finally, definitively, held. In the days that followed the enforcement notice, the air shifted, not with triumph, not with loud relief, but with the slow unwinding of tension that had gripped the soil itself. Ella didn't expect cheers, and she certainly didn't expect apologies. What she felt instead was the gentle return of normalcy, a rhythm she had almost forgotten. The quiet scrape of hooves against barn flooring at dawn, the soft murmur of students asking questions without hesitation, the sound of her own boots on, gravel without the sense of being watched. For the first time in months, she moved through her routine without the silent weight of anticipation pressing against her chest, and that absence became its own kind of victory. Karen didn't appear. Her observation platform remained empty. The garden lights that had once flickered across Ella's property line stayed off. The incense stopped drifting through the hedges. Her videos vanished from the regular schedule, and while her social media accounts remained online, the tone had changed. Less direct, more philosophical, a kind of soft retreat that was neither concession nor denial. It was as if she had disappeared into the digital fog she had once used as a weapon, leaving behind curated images of morning tea and introspective captions about surrendering to life's currents. She never acknowledged the enforcement notice publicly, never addressed the citations, and certainly never mentioned Ella again. But absence speaks, and in this case it said everything. Ella focused on the goats. That was always the point. They had weathered the tension better than most would expect. Animals had a way of living in the present, absorbing stress without internalizing it, shaking off disturbance like dust in the wind. The younger ones had adjusted to the tagged collars. The older does, especially the matriarch, had taken on a kind of quiet watchfulness that reminded Ella why she had begun this work in the first place. There was dignity in their simplicity. There was steadiness in their trust. She didn't anthropomorphize them, not anymore, but she respected them, respected that they never once stopped being what they were, even as the world around them spiraled into accusation and absurdity. The college extended the program. What had started as a probationary partnership was renewed with a 3-year commitment, funding included. The board cited not only Ella's diligence but the exemplary handling of external conflict through institutional channels, a phrase that made her laugh for its cold precision. But it was accurate. She hadn't thrown punches. She hadn't raised her voice. She had documented, reported, responded. When the world tried to shake her foundation, she built around it, reinforced it, until the storm moved on and the structure still stood. That, in the end, was more powerful than any dramatic retaliation. The neighboring residents, those who had once stayed silent or neutral, began to show quiet signs of support. Not declarations, not grand apologies, but simple acts. A couple left a handwritten note thanking her for standing her ground. One neighbor dropped off a bag of carrots with no explanation. Even Lucas Beale, the software contractor with the artificial turf, walked over one morning and asked if she'd be open to letting his niece, who had developmental challenges, spend an afternoon with the goats. Ella said yes, not out of pity or performance, but because it was the right thing to do. The child arrived a week later with wide eyes and hesitant steps, and by the end of the visit she was laughing at a goat who kept trying to nibble her shoelaces. That laughter rang through the barn like a bell. In time, Ella replaced the damaged tag that had been burned. She laminated a new one with the same wording and added one change, a stamped code at the bottom, identifying it as the version 2. She didn't need to hang it on a goat. She mounted it on a wooden post at the entrance to the pasture, beneath the standard sign denoting the property as an educational agricultural site. Below it, in smaller print, she added a new line of her own, one that wasn't quoted from a regulation or a compliance manual. Respect isn't silent, it's consistent. There were still moments, late at night, when she walked the fence line and looked toward the trees on the far side of the property. The shadows still whispered. The wind still stirred strange movements through the leaves. But the fear had gone. What remained was awareness, a kind of permanent preparedness that came not from paranoia, but from knowledge. She knew now what it meant to defend something, not with weapons but with structure, not with noise but with clarity. She didn't forgive Karen, not because she held a grudge, but because forgiveness wasn't the point. Karen had chosen her methods, hidden behind ideals, blurred the line between activism and aggression. What Karen did wasn't a mistake. It was a campaign, and Ella had responded with the only thing that stopped campaigns: resistance rooted in law, logic, and unwavering presence. That was enough. One morning, months later, a city contractor arrived to trim trees near the boundary road. As his truck backed up near the edge of Karen's property, a sheet of plywood that had been leaning against her privacy fence fell forward, revealing the faded remnants of an old hand-painted sign. The words were chipped and weathered, but still legible. "Let them be free." Ella looked at it from her side of the pasture, arms folded, breath rising in slow plumes. She didn't smile. She didn't scoff. She turned, whistled once, and let the goats out into the sunlight.